Yeah, I mean, that's true.
So you're based out on the West Coast then?
Yeah, I see.
See how long we can last. I don't even see him. Oh, good. Okay. Hi, I'm Tim Kane, Chief Economist of the Hudson Institute. I'll be moderating your panel. I was actually just waiting for a moment to see that I had permission from the State Department. They might never give me a visa to travel again. So apparently I've got a thumbs up. So moderating this panel reminds me of that first class I had to instruct as a graduate student at UC San Diego in ops research, which was an interesting assignment because I'd never taken a class in ops research. So I did okay, though. I learned more about it than I expected. So on behavioral economics, we're looking at, in this panel, how behavioral economics interfaces with national security. So even not taking a class on behavioral econ, other than some of the standard microeconomics you get at graduate school, I have written a book on the topic. So that qualifies as an expert in our day and age. So I think we've got, this is my only slide. Glenn Hubbard and I just published a book comparing the United States to fallen empires in the past, and we try to make it not a pessimistic book with that premise, but use some of the lessons of behavioral economics and assume they apply international issues. Assume that nations may behave in rational but seemingly irrational ways. The one lesson that Glenn and I drew for the United States is that whole political parties, when they become hyperpolarized, get trapped in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, which is one of the classic insights of behavioral economics. And that one party knows that it wants lower taxes and lower government, but it makes the wrong choice for only lower taxes. And the other party knows that it likes higher taxes and higher spending, but it only makes one of those choices for higher spending, and you end up in a paradox where there's rational choice to be economically imbalanced. These are the kind of traps that have caught empires in the past. Now, we wrote this whole book, just published, not knowing if we were able to make that leap from people to nations or larger bodies, hoping that the research of these smart guys catches up with us. So with that, let me do the introduction, and we think we've got our presentations in this order. So Drew's going to, we think, go first. We'll see when the first set of slides here comes up, but let me do this quick introduction. So Drew Conway is he calls himself scientist in residence.
They call me that.
Drew Conway, scientist in residence at IA Ventures, a leading expert in the application of computational methods to social behavioral problems at large scale. He's been writing and speaking about the role of data in the discipline of data science in industry, government, and academia for several years. Drew's advised and consulted numerous companies across many interesting industries, ranging from fledgling startups to Fortune 100 companies, as well as academic institutions and federal agencies. He started his career in counterterrorism as a computational social scientist in the U.S. intelligence community and received his PhD in political science from NYU in May 2013. So, Drew, I think you are first here.
Cool. So thanks everybody for having me here today. I can totally appreciate what Tim was saying. I have no formal training in machine learning, but I wrote a book on it, so it worked out. It's good. You don't need to be trained to actually have strong opinions or knowledge about something. So we were given 5 minutes to talk today, and really I just want to kind of introduce a series of questions motivated by some anecdotes or things in the news that I've seen to really get around this idea of sort of what is technology's role in quote-unquote nudging foreign policy kind of the topic of discussion here. And any bonus points if anyone can name the game that I'm featuring there on the slide? Anyone? Marble Madness, yes, wow. Thank you. Great game. Anyway, everyone knows that right now in Turkey there's a lot of unrest, there's riots happening and lots of protests happening in Turkey. But a piece of news came out recently that during the protests in Turkey, CNN International was not airing the video of the protests in Turkey. They're airing a documentary on penguins, which is kind of an interesting piece. And the fact that that information was able to get out of Turkey into the sort of global information sphere allowed something like this to be made. So this is a meme that someone in Turkey made to represent the penguins in the protest, right? So the idea here is that, you know, in these situations where, this is not a new question or new idea, but one that I think is particularly pertinent to the conversations that we've been hearing today and probably for this panel, which is in a very information-rich environment, in an environment where there's very little control over the dynamics of information flows in and out of something where there's lots of civil unrest. Who's most empowered by that free-flowing information? You know, is it actually the state itself who's able to use that information to try to control the situation? Is it the citizens, like, who can create these kind of like internationally consumable memes or push information out and have people change their Twitter colors to green and things like that? Or is it actually just sort of us or the world in general who get to observe this and sort of understand what's happening there? But maybe the question is then, how do we take that and kind of nudge people to be involved in a more meaningful way? So I want to use that example as one question to put out there. So the second one, and is particularly pertinent to everything we've heard from the NSA in the last couple of days and is interesting, is of course now China and the US are thinking about having these sort of diplomatic discussions around cyber warfare and hacking and state-sponsored hacking, right? And so this is a really interesting question to me because I think that there's this real weird split or divergence between the idea of diplomacy as it's existed for hundreds of years and diplomacy how it may exist in a non-state world. So the idea is, like, is there even a notion of diplomacy on the internet, right? On the internet, no one knows that you're a dog, right? So what does diplomacy actually mean in an environment where that's the sort of standard operating procedure of the way things work? So that's another question I think may be interesting to sort of think about, and I would love to get questions from the audience. And then finally, this is something that, you know, as a New Englander and as a New Yorker is sort of important to me. So, of course, when the Boston bombings happened, we had a very information-rich environment around that, right? Lots of images were taken, lots of images were pushed to the internet around the bomb site, lots of people were inferring who might have been what, and then of course on Reddit, which is a very popular website, and on 4chan, another very popular website, there are all these people who are consuming all of those images and saying, I think that those are the people, it's very likely that they're, because the time this picture was taken, and I can see they're wearing a backpack, right? So much so that my local newspaper, the New York Post, published a picture of two innocent people calling them bagmen, right? So in an information-rich environment like that, have we entered into this age of kind of internet or crowdsourced vigilantism, and what are the consequences for that, right? How do we actually think about checking that, or who should be the check? Should it be the media? Should it be the state? Is there a way to think about policing the internet itself? I mean, Reddit as a website is based on user input of like upvotes and downvotes, right? So they upvoted something that turned out to be really bad. So how do we think about actually policing it? So those are my 3 questions, and those are my 5 minutes, and thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. So my fellow tie wearer, we didn't get the memo, Will Tucker. So Will Tucker's got a fascinating bio. He's vice president at Ideas 42. He works on household finance, consumer protection, anti-poverty projects. Born in Iowa, grew up in Iowa and Japan, and also worked on the Obama campaign in 2008 in Iowa. He's a Truman Scholar, graduated with degrees in African Studies and Public Policy and American institutions from Brown University, then went on to Princeton where he got a master's degree from the Woodrow Wilson School with a certificate in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy. He's worked at the U.S. Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Management and Budget and director of the Rhode Island Institute Urban Debate League in Public Health and Information Technology Evaluation. And he's got a fascinating presentation that I've actually taken a look at. So Will, please.
Sure. That was a data mine bio, I think, put together, not by me. But in any case, we'll try to run through, this is next, some of this stuff quickly. Since we have a limited amount of time, I'll just leave all the punchlines out. I talked a little bit about this at lunch during the Ignite sessions, but if anyone has questions about who we are, what we do at Ideas 42, we try to use behavioral economics to do good. So, real quickly, this is what we're going to try to do today, try to make 6 points. What is behavioral economics in the context of international development and diplomacy? And that's pretty much captures all of behavioral economics. We like to think it does. We have some folks all dressed up to go to the gym, and they are taking the escalator up the staircase. So action is not necessarily intention or decision, and humans are complicated creatures. Now, that may be because Daniel Kahneman likes to talk about two systems for processing things: the heuristics that we heard about earlier from Professor Taleb, and also sort of slow thinking, like Spock, where we make cost-benefit analyses for everything and make the best optimal decisions. The alternative being working from the gut. The fact is that we both have all of these things, both of these capacities, to some degree, and we're capable of showing or appearing as both of these in any given context. So the first quick thing we want to do with behavioral economics, and we talked about this a bit at lunch as well, is that small differences can have big impacts. So a classic example, because there's not time to talk about 401ks, would be an organ donation, whether you have to sign a paper to donate organs or sign a paper to not donate organs, can have, or appears to be correlated with some pretty dramatic differences in organ donation consent rates. You might say, what does that have to do with me? I'm already an organ donor like everyone in this room is. I was going to...
the monkey business.
Oh, here we go. It'll play.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
You guys are pretty good, so I won't even distract you while it's playing. Great, everybody get it?
The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla?
Okay.
For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game?
There we go. Since we're short on time, I won't make you watch it again. But
Come on.
that's all fun and games.
Who wants to see the gorilla? I didn't see the gorilla.
You can take my word for it. It's on YouTube. There was a gorilla, just as there's in fact a gorilla here. This is a follow-up study this folks did with radiologists, where they show up an MRI of a lung scan and say, look for some cancerous nodes. It may be difficult to see on the screen, but the actual same gorilla suit is up there. And 83% of radiologists did not see that in the study. Perhaps some implications for use of big data in decision making and all of the information that is thrown at us. While our computers increase processing power, actually ourselves, we can only handle so much at any given time. So real quick, we also know, and I talked about this at lunch as well, that people are very overconfident, particularly about their future behavior. So if you take a classic example from going to the gym, you could either get a monthly membership for $80 or pay $10 for each instance. Now, I know if you're like me, I'm going to go to the gym 8 times a week. So of course you go with a monthly membership. But what actually ends up happening is that people don't predict their future behavior too well, and they end up making sort of suboptimal decisions, you might say. Another quick insight with relevance for this topic is the difficulties around self-control. So another fun example of this would be the marshmallow test, which a study done in the 70s, and you can replicate it with kids you know if you like, where you give a kid a marshmallow and place it in front of them and say, here's a great marshmallow, it's tasty, it's wonderful, but if you wait 15 minutes, I will give you another marshmallow. Of course, people say, yeah, I want 2 marshmallows, not 1. But then sitting with the marshmallow in front of them, it turns out that we don't actually like that very much, and it's very difficult, and eventually some people fail, and it's self-control is tough. Third, and this is an interesting one that we're starting to learn more about, is how scarcity works. And so this is an example of sugarcane farmers, which is a nice teaching example because they have very different cash situations before and after harvest. So their expenditures are a lot more after the harvest. They have more money, they sell off the cane, and they're more relaxed. It's before harvest, things are tight, they're stressed out, and they actually respond to things in a different way, even down it's just sort of like the neurological level. Their response time to new stimulus decreases when they have more capacity, and so depending on the context, the same folks that you're trying to work with are in, you can get different responses and different. So then how do you use these insights to try to make things better, to try to help people get to the outcomes that they would like to see? Well, the first lesson here, it could just be one lesson, but if we want something to happen, then we need to make it as easy as possible. So a simple example of that, if you want people to adhere to their medication regime, put an alarm on the pill bottle that goes off and flashes when they need to take their medication. Right? Don't count on all of us, forget. Everybody does. We know that people forget, but we leave important decisions up to the virtue of remembering. Second, little things about how you frame and how you state messaging can make a big difference, and often in counterintuitive ways. So here's an example from South Africa where a bank reached out to customers that had previously taken out loans with an advertisement for a new loan, a short-term loan, and varied a variety of different things. But perhaps the most interesting was just including a picture of a smiling woman, like on the top example, versus a picture of a smiling man, caused the same increase in uptake in loans as a decrease in 200 basis points in the interest rate would have been. And for men, as 450 basis points. And finally, and this is something that I think we should think more about in terms of how we structure our policy, and that we like to think about. Even the perfect, with a perfectly designed program or designed intervention, great insights, and a wonderful project that you want to put into place, an implementing partner on the ground can either multiply or divide the impact of that significantly. And so how we structure these programs can make a big difference as well. So in a domestic example around consumer finance, we started a project recently called the Beta Project with the City Foundation, where they engaged us and the Corporation for Enterprise Development here in DC to provide behavioral economics assistance to a bunch of different organizations, and they set up a competition saying, please apply for this free consulting. The benefits of this type of setup, it's simple. It's different from us going out and knocking on a bunch of doors and asking for participate. Is that you end up getting a lot of different players in the room talking to each other. You get to hear from 110 different organizations about what their issues are on the ground and what they're facing, and you end up with partners that are very engaged and excited to work on, the issues around individual consumers' behaviors at the organizational level. So with that, I think I'm probably over 5 minutes, but
No, yeah, but that's great.
I'll blame the gorilla.
And we'll let you take longer if you'll show the video again, too. But,
You really want to see that video again?
I'm missing the point. The point is we talk about big ideas, and I'm still stuck on the Carney tricks. But I've got some great questions, a nice presentation, and maybe one that I'll just sort of throw out for you to think of, and we'll move on, is we're thinking about development. And what are the challenges, though, that a country faces, or that we face with our diplomacy in the United States when we're looking at poor countries? Are they caught in some kind of a trap? That's one idea, where behaviorally you get caught in these traps which are rationally They're sort of maxing in. They're not maximizing their total potential, income potential, jobs potential, development potential, because there's some sort of behavioral trap. Or is it bounded rationality, where they've only got enough attention span as a small government or as a people just trying to survive, that they can't expand their mindsets bigger. And so it's what some economists call an ignorance problem. So we need to have developmental aid to go in. And some economists have challenged the idea of that. So is it one or the other, or is there some sort of third behavioral trap that we face? Maybe we'll get the answers here in a second. So Matt Wallert from Bing is a behavioral scientist at Bing, working at the intersection of psychology and technology. After spending several years as an academic doing research on judgment and decision making, he became a serial entrepreneur, angel investor, and advisor. Now works on advancing human progress through the application of psychological science to changing everyday behaviors. So Matt, I think you have a presentation as well, and we'll do a moderated conversation after that.
I do have a presentation, and it was set up so well by sitting next to Will. Some of Will's colleagues at Ideas 42 are great and well-respected researchers that I know well. And so this is one continuous talk here, although we did not plan it. I'm actually going to try and suggest how, without hiring Will, you can do some of this stuff yourself. So how you can really strategically look at changing behaviors based on the psychological principles he just sort of pointed out to you. And one really important part I'm going to try and start off with is the fact that when we talk about deciding, most of the actions that people take are not conscious, right? They're not sitting around deliberating, making these decisions. Most of the things that we in this room care about with foreign policy are unconscious. Tim Wilson used to say, we're strangers to ourselves, right? And so what I'm going to try and convince you is that you should stop trying to convince people of things. We tend to talk about our decisions in a way like they're conscious and deliberate, and what that implies is that, well, if we just rationalize things, if we just talk to people about them, surely the information will compel them to act the way we want them to act. And I want to challenge that assumption. I think what we want to try and influence in this room is the environments in which people live their lives, and the environments in which they make their decisions. So I'm going to try and make it really easy on you. I'm going to give you the secret to changing behaviors. Are you ready? Here it is. Really complicated, 4 squares. I'm going to fill it in a little. So one way of looking at human behavior is as a product of competing pressures, promoting pressures, that arrow, reasons to do something, right? And inhibiting pressures, reasons not to do something. And if you start thinking about this model, it lays out a way to change people's behavior. Let me run through a quick example and we'll see if it's clear, and then we'll get it open to questions. So as a quick example, why do people eat more junk food than healthy food, right? Think about the promoting pressures for junk food. It tastes good. There's a ton of advertising for it. The soda industry alone spent just an enormous amount of money, $1.5 billion, right, in a quarter to advertise this to you, right? And we're naturally programmed to seek out calories. So we have some external factors, we also have some internal stuff that's going on. Those are all really strong forces. And the inhibiting factors are really weak, right? The cost of junk food is really low in this country, right? It's incredibly available and convenient, both to buy and consume. It comes in great packages, they don't spoil, and you can buy them anywhere and you can carry them anywhere. So then we look at the competing behavior, right? Healthy food. The promoting pressures are low. There's not a lot of calories. It doesn't taste very good. And dollar for dollar, there's not that much advertising for it as compared to junk food, right? Because it's not as profitable of an industry. And the inhibiting pressures are really high, right? It's expensive comparatively. It spoils, right? It's hard to carry around. Carrying around enough apples to satiate yourself versus enough candy to satiate yourself is a completely different exercise. And if you've been in any urban poor environment in this country, you will know how totally unavailable good healthy food is. Maybe your bodega has some like week-old fruit. I spent a bunch of time in college at Swarthmore. There's an economic ghetto near us that I used to volunteer in. They had, for this town of about 20,000 people, literally no supermarket of any kind. Everyone shopped at a bodega. Right? While that's still a problem, You're never going to get those people to eat healthy food. But we can change this behavior by changing the environment in which they're making these food decisions. Right? This is what foreign policy is about. We very rarely get to go to individual people and countries and try and modify their individual environments. But we can modify the macro environment in which they're making these decisions. We can launch those kinds of programs. That's what Idea 42 does. You can do it too. Right? So imagine if we want to change this healthy food, junk food dichotomy. So instead of looking like this, right, this is what we spelled out earlier, we made it look a little more like this. Right? We control some of the things up here. We can't control how good junk food tastes. It would be really hard to go to Pepsi and say, hey, look, I want you to make those chips just, make them taste a little more awful. Could you? Right? They're not going to do that. And we can't make it spoil faster, right? Inject some things in there so that Doritos have a, 2-day shelf life. But we can change some of the other factors, right? We can subsidize healthy food and tax junk food. So we put in place a strong inhibiting pressure on junk food, and we weaken the inhibiting pressures on healthy food, right? We can change where junk food is sold to make it harder to get and more inconvenient to carry. They tried to do this in New York City. Unfortunately, it was, recently overturned. But just trying to make it so that, hey, if you want to carry around a bunch of really sugared soda, it's actually going to be really hard to do. We're going to make you carry a bunch of little tiny bottles. It's going to be a big pain in the ass, right? And we're going to make that diet stuff much easier, right? We're going to find new ways to package healthy food, to preserve it, and make it available in urban markets. Right? We can change that choice environment. So that's my pitch. I don't want you to try and convince people to be different. I want you to create an environment that does it for you. I want you to change the choice environment. And all of what I just did is an exercise that you could walk through for any program that you are directing in any country. You can work with researchers there to figure out what pressures are pushing people around, and then you can change those pressures. Thank you.
It's great. Great. I keep thinking North Korea. How can we use carrots and sticks and change the environment for North Korea? That's a hard one. But Drew, I want to come back to you because when I saw your presentation before, I thought of the book 1984 and about how information in 1948 was imagined to be empowering governments but not people. And now it seems to me that it's empowering people, or they can put out these penguin memes. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think that it's very much a double-edged sword. I mean, so I use the example of a meme because I think it's a sort of vacuous, costless thing, right? So it's like, there's all this information, and at the end of the day, you get a meme out of it, and you get people who aren't going to take any sort of risky or physical action towards some end to change their Twitter avatar or like some page on Facebook. So, I mean, this is not my idea, right? This has been out there for a while. I think that it's a really serious question with respect to all, and this isn't really a big data thing, this is more just sort of information technology, like lowercase I, lowercase t. The ability of dictators and, oppressive governments to not just, the questions have been asked several times today about sort of injecting misinformation into an environment.
Right.
Like, that's one problem, but now it's much easier just to monitor the environment, to understand not necessarily I want to, fool the U.S. government into thinking everything's okay. It's sort of obvious that that's not the case. But if you're in, a crisis environment and the government knows, all right, here are the top 10 most followed people on Twitter, I can go out and find who that is and kind of shut down their accounts or, whatever it may be. I think that it's very much a balancing act between the two. Yes, of course, people are very empowered, and the fact that we have such an information-rich environment allows us to have this conversation, because we might not even know that these things are happening. But the point is, I think, going from knowing to doing, the technology doesn't seem to do a lot to push us in that direction yet.
Now let's imagine that John Kerry is watching, right, the Secretary of State, and we're thinking, as a nation, we want to fight world poverty. So, Chad's one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country on some measures in the world. In our hemisphere, Haiti, let's think of some countries in Central America that are poor, and we want to help them. How do we use these new tools? And I come back to, remember years ago, talked about public diplomacy in the Middle East, as if we needed a new advertising campaign. And I don't know if it's so much the content as it is the medium. Like if you had Haiti Wired, if everybody had a smartphone, and those are out-of-the-box ideas that probably aren't. But if instead, maybe it's our strategy to try to just make the internet available in more parts of the world. Is that a smart strategy that helps create that environment for change? So Drew, let me ask you that, and then if we can, I think all of us might have some thoughts on that too.
Well, I think that much of the sort of evidence from poor parts of the world is that, yes, sort of getting cell phones into poor areas and allowing people to sort of use SMS to get information is certainly empowering in the sense that it allows them to have knowledge about what's going on, but probably even on a larger sense, it allows people to understand the sort of needs and dynamics of places like this. So, in part of my work, I work with an organization called the Grameen Foundation, and so this is what they do. They sort of monitor the questions that are being asked with smartphones in poor areas, and that's great. And I think that is a way of just sort of monitoring and understanding. I do not view that as sort of, well, as long as if we push the internet on people, the internet will solve the problem. Right? I don't think that that's true. I mean, it allows us to have a looking glass into something, and big data, which is the theme of today. Big data allows us to understand those dynamics at a larger scale, so we can try to predict or cluster or categorize what things are happening in certain places, and with geolocations or where those things are happening. That's great, but at the very micro level, I don't think that information in and of itself is actually providing a path to success.
That's interesting. I want to disagree with you, because my recollection is, as repugnant as racism was, it was those images of racism in the 1960s in that media environment that moved public opinion. And Francis Fukuyama says it was the VCR that revolutionized things in Russia, where they had tapes of watching Dallas, and that changed the way they saw the West and themselves by contrast. So maybe you're not saying that, but let me turn it over and we can re-engage in this. So Matt, Will, do you guys have some thoughts on this, how to fight poverty, how to use behavioral economics?
Sure. I think, Drew, like you were mentioning, the sort of the SMS, the sort of use of mobile technology to provide access to new services, or to information at least about new services, has the potential. I don't know that it will do it automatically. There are things, whether it's using fertilizer, getting crop insurance, or things that we think can make a big difference, different irrigation techniques in sort of bringing people out of poverty, but we see difficulty in getting them to adopt those techniques. So having more ways to give them information, and more ways to sort of show different social norms of using it, whether you can have the cast of Dallas sort of reenact some of those things. There's potential there. I don't know that it'll just happen automatically.
Sure.
I don't think that would.
So, and I think that largely was part of Drew's point, right? I think there's this hesitancy, especially among young, tech-savvy people who are working in this industry, to hear people, just like we kind of cringe when people make it sound like big data will solve everything, make it sound like the internet will solve everything. I think that's what you're saying, is that's not the case.
And they're sort of the same, one is a function of the other. It's like big data exists on the internet, so it's like they're very much intertwined, and one's sort of a medium to the other.
And so I think, to your point about sort of, one thing I should emphasize, and I guess I didn't emphasize it enough in my sort of framework, is that all of those sort of promoting and inhibiting forces are ultimately filtered through the human mind, right? Whether they're done consciously or unconsciously, they're filtered through human perception, and feelings are an important part of that perception. So iconic images, iconic images of racism are a great inhibiting pressure, right? Television shows about Dallas are a great promoting pressure of what abundancy looks like. We need to make those things visceral and real. So we shouldn't take models like this and say, well, Matt drew these promoting and inhibiting pressures, and so we're just going to do incredibly rational sort of equations of what those promoting and inhibiting pressures are. Emotion is an incredibly important part of that. And so I think that one of the things that the internet allows for is diversity of message, right? Because it's very, very hard to know what individual image will spark an emotional response in a person, right, reliably. But if in the presence of having larger mediums where things like memes can pop up, right? Maybe the funny meme doesn't do it for you. Maybe you need the tragic picture. Maybe you need the logical argument. Maybe you need this and you need that. We can now push out diverse messages that capture larger swaths of the population because the cost of doing so is so much lower.
Well, then I wonder, though, in an environment where there's so much access to, like, I think photography is actually an excellent example of this, right? So it's like you could name any number of sort of pivotal crisis moments in international relations of the last 30, 40 years. You might have one image that comes to mind. So like Tiananmen Square, one image that comes to mind. You think about the segregated South, and there's you have images of like police dogs and fire hoses and that image. But now, if you think like, Arab Spring, there's not one image that comes to mind, right? You think, Sub-Saharan Africa and conflict in the Congo, there's not one image that comes to mind. So maybe it is the fact that there's so much, and the value of each one of those is diminished by the volume. Right. They're actually not in this space anymore.
I mean, I think Will, in some ways, was actually talking about this point, right? And that, we are competing for cognitive resources. But I mean, tech also can bring those back together again, right? So we looked at, photo stitching in the case of the Boston bombings, where for the first time there were so many photos taken that we could actually stitch together a 3D environment that people could explore, and sometimes that's very powerful. I mean, it's very possible that there's an Apple ad out right now that drives me a little bit crazy, and it's just people taking pictures of freaking everything, right? And like the tagline at the very end is like, more people taking pictures on an iPhone every day than any other camera, and you're sort of like looking at it and going, man, they're just taking pictures of everything. Is there no discernment anymore? And so how we craft those messages really matters, right? Yeah. I mean, how do you stick out from, as sort of was said by the professor, right? Like, as you increase the amount of data, the more noise. I mean, the number of photos that just don't do anything.
I bet every one of us, and probably everyone in this room, who's either had a conversation with children in their family or given a class. As an economist, this seemed to happen in my classes where someone would ask about capitalism, is it really better than communism? And for a long time, the world was sort of trapped in these choices. And yet, when I've talked to colleagues and friends, and especially young people in foreign countries that were less developed, the isms were relevant. And I had friends in China during the Tiananmen Square time, and there wasn't a fight about capitalism and communism. In their mind, it was that they wanted to be wealthier. They wanted their children to live longer and not die of diseases that there were cures for. And so every poor country, I think, has this aspiration. It's whether they've actually been part of this wired world. So I tend to have this bias that a wired world is a better world. There's all this noise, but at least there's some comparative image. And Andrew Gelman, I think, was wanted to speak today. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get him at this late point, but part of his research is that all data is comparative data, essentially. And when we give people data and they can compare their station in life and their limits, I'm going to turn this into a question now, Will, for you. I love the marshmallow story, right? We talk about it in our book, Balance, and ask who in a country is in control of whether or not they eat the marshmallow, right? When a country makes a short-term choice at the expense of the long-term, usually that's a ruling elite, I would propose. And the people, if they knew the alternatives, would want to make more investments for their children's future. Is that a right way to see the world, Will?
It's one way to see the world. I mean, there's some interesting follow-on studies to the Marshmallow Study that may have some relevance here as well. So, for instance, if you before you do the Marshmallow Study, you say that you're going to come back with some extra markers for the kids to color with, and then in a control condition, you actually come back with the markers, and in a treatment condition, you don't.
Right.
And so there's not necessarily trust of the person offering the marshmallow. Those folks eat the marshmallow right away if there's no trust built up.
Really?
Yeah.
So you get the markers or you eat the marshmallow?
No, you don't get them.
Okay.
When the researcher tells you they're going to come back with markers, then they don't.
Okay.
You take what you have in front of you.
Right.
Which may or may not be the case when we're dealing between
because
nations.
distracting strategies in the first experiment, where the kids that started to treat the marshmallow not as an edible object but like as a toy, and they would pretend it was an animal.
Sure.
They didn't eat it. if they were able to distract themselves. I
Or you
recall
look
that.
away, or if you prime them with sort of cool thoughts, like thinking about the texture of the marshmallow versus like how warm and gooey it would be if you ate it. All those things can have impact. I'm not sure where that takes the metaphor.
Right. I keep thinking of, talking to the Castro brothers, and they have this incentive to preserve the short term, to eat the marshmallow now rather than make investments. So how does that guide diplomacy? Or maybe another way to ask this question is, what is diplomacy? Because diplomacy for hundreds of years meant information didn't cross borders and it didn't cross oceans. So you needed experts that were sharing the right information. So is that irrelevant now in a world where we've got an internet? That's a big question.
That's a big question, right? Like, so, if you look at, I think we can look at big data and the way search engines have prolificated through the world and allow people to access knowledge in a new way. I think that's tremendously empowering. To say, again, I go back to Drew's point, though, it's not the end of the story, right? It also, the reason that we need search engines is because there's a lot of noise, right? And, in a time before search engines, there was this period where the noise, sort of surpassed our ability to deal with the noise. And then, that had huge negative effects for people, right? Where people were, you would search engines were dumb. And I knew that, hey, people were searching for mortgages and I wanted to bring them to my page, so I spuriously tagged it with mortgages, and a lot of disinformation happened, right? So as quickly as we generate new information, we have to generate ways to filter and control and sort that information.
Yeah, and I think sort of to answer your question about diplomacy, the internet knows a lot about people who are on the internet, and it knows nothing else. Right? So it's like relevant to the search term question, which is like, if you're looking for mortgages on Bing, Bing can tell you everything there is to know about everybody else who searched for mortgages on Bing, but not at all about the typical American who is not represented by the full sample of people on the internet, which are sort of wealthier than average, more educated than average, and have access to infrastructure maybe more than average. And like, you go outside of the U.S. or the developed world, and those things become exponentially more important, because like, I would hate to live in a nation where the diplomacy was a function of like the Twitter stream. That would be very dangerous, because the information coming into that would just be a sample of people on Twitter, right? Which is very unrepresentative maybe of every country.
Yeah, I think my Twitter stream is still talking about Tony Parker and did he get that last second shot off. So, and I don't know, but
I think you did.
yeah. So you're right, we might be distracted and bread and circuses, so maybe that's not a good thing. Any other thoughts, Will, on what is diplomacy?
What is diplomacy?
I feel like there's probably people in the audience who could answer that way.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, on what behavioral economics has to say about diplomacy, there is an entire literature around negotiation. There is an entire literature around sort of game theory. I think I'm not as up on them as I could be. I think they're not necessarily at the point where they're incorporating changes in information technology into those models yet. But I think we know that decision makers in organizations and in states are like the rest of us, aside from certain things. And so a lot of the sort of difficulties that individuals have making decisions also, this is sort of the next frontier of where behavioral economics, I think, really has to go. But institutions will show some of those same things around having, planning fallacies, around being overconfident, around, being bad with probabilities.
Yeah.
That even with, access to all this data and all the information, if you project those biases onto, the regressions that you run or all the fancy techniques that you use, that's what we heard from the last speaker.
Okay, so Matt, I'm going to ask you about, just to broaden the scope a little bit, when I thought of behavioral economics applying to foreign policy, I thought of the lesson of loss aversion, right, that people are really sensitive to short-term gains and short-term losses, but particularly the losses. And wealthier countries may get in their own trap of they stop innovating institutionally. I want to just ask broadly, where you think behavioral economics and some of the things you talked about promoting behaviors and inhibiting behaviors, where do you see that in foreign policy in general?
Well, I mean, we could go back to the food example, right? So I've worked with doctors in Africa who said, look, one of the important health problems that we're having in Africa right now is the rise of heart disease, in part because the food is relatively bland, and so they're oversalting it, right? And that's raising cholesterol and causing heart disease. And so we actually sat down with doctors and sort of wrote this out, right? And looked at basically, could we introduce another spice, right? So could you make readily available, cheap, and something that would fulfill the same promoting pressure, right? The promoting pressure was make my bland food not taste bland, right? So could I take that same promoting pressure and move it to another environment, right? This is the same that we beat smoking. China is leading the world in anti-smoking technology right now because they're trying to get their population, which they largely ignored for a long time, to stop smoking, right? And we beat that in this country by following this roadmap, right? We said we're going to tax it, we're going to ban where you can advertise it, we're going to start advertising, competitive things, whether it was, we tried gum in the 80s, that didn't work so well, now we have healthy inhalers and those sorts of things, and we're going to make those really cheap, right? So I think you can see China start to kind of catch on to these are the things that they're going to do in their country, and I think that we can apply those abroad to all sorts of different kinds of issues.
Yeah,
And Will, same question to you.
on the loss aversion point, I don't know if nations as a whole, I don't know if I'll take a strong opinion on that, are more or less loss averse than individuals. I will say that institutions and government agencies probably do feel the loss of losing something significantly more than they would feel good about the gain of that same amount, which is the sort of the finding of loss aversion, right? So that when it comes to territory or influence, that's it's more important not to lose what you have than to gain new additional influence.
Right. There's a moral question too about behavioral economics. I mean, this is sort of a technocratic fantasy, right? That we can nudge people and they won't mind. But is it something? This is certainly the fear of that Uncle Sam is trying to push the world to behave in a certain way that they say is for the general good. Are you all worried about that? Are you sensitive to that? And Drew, what are your thoughts about nudging? Is it morally right to even engage in this conversation? Should we be nudging poor countries?
It's certainly morally right to engage in the conversation. But, I don't think, I think that the idea that if there are behaviors that, like the smoking example or heart disease example, are sort of obviously bad, right, sort of physiologically bad for you, then adding information to that environment, I think, is probably a very positive thing. And whether that nudging is through advertising or diplomatic means, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think in the end, the ultimate decision that the human being is going to make is going to be one of self-realization. So if nudging helps that, I think that that's great, and I don't have a sort of moral imperative to say that that's bad. But I don't think that there's a blanket sort of yes, we should do this all the time. I don't know, this sort of probably seems like an unconscious theme that's coming out of everything that I'm saying, but it's I don't think there is a sort of one-off-all solution to these things. Behavioral economics as a discipline tends to be sort of highly focused on specific, test cases of observation, and in this specific case, humans did this, because there's this whole other thing that sort of wraps around behavioral economics, which is rationality, and we believe that humans are rational in certain things, and why are they not in these cases? So there's still those two competing schools of thought, really, in all of this research. And so we should not be sort of thinking blanket statements, say, in this specific case, is the behavior negative enough, or do we want to do a nudge? Yes. And what does the research show, and what do people know?
I want to sort of echo on Drew's point about the conversation is, we always have to be having the conversation, and we shouldn't shy away from that for moral reasons. I use the following example with my students, right? Why do you take a girl to a scary movie, right? Because she's going to snuggle a little closer, right? Misattribution of arousal. She's scared, she's going to mistake that for arousal, and she's going to be more attracted to you. The same thing works for spicy food and taking her on a roller coaster. Men have been employing these dating strategies for longer than we've known why we've done them.
It works for Friday afternoon panelists.
There you go. But so we've been employing these strategies long before we knew what misattribution of arousal was. And does knowing what misattribution of arousal is mean that you shouldn't employ those strategies? Maybe, but it at least means that you should be conscious of the fact that you now know and that you are employing it strategically. So I think that, would I like people in this room to take the things that I'm saying to topple good governments? No. Would I like them to use them to topple bad governments? Yes. But that's the same question we've always had about what's a good government and what's a bad government, right? And that's not a question that's changed by the conversation about the abilities. That's a conversation that is larger and far more important than we would ever answer on this panel.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, we should certainly be having the conversation. I think somebody mentioned the soda ban up in New York. It's not really a ban, but and I know
Not anything anymore.
Yeah. Organizationally, I think I'm supposed to say that we disagree with that. I personally think it's kind of silly that you can sell like a 40-ounce beverage and call it a medium. I think that's not truth in advertising, but when we propose things, it's never about restricting choice or making choices for people. There's still an action that happens. There's still a choice that individuals make.
Yeah.
And the thing that we forget is that we are already making these choices for people by our inaction or by just the structure, the architecture in which the choice is made currently. And to say that we can't change anything about that ignores, you mentioned the bad governments, but I mean, we'd be foolish to think that marketers, that we aren't bombarded with these things every day we walk into a store, every day we go anywhere. These techniques are being used to varying degrees of sophistication.
By businesses. I mean, there's a distinction between businesses and governments using nudging, right?
Well, the imagery used in New York by the pro-beverage campaign was very sort of government-y. It looked just like it was ripped out of a political campaign. It was the silhouette of a man holding a beverage above his head and saying, you have choice.
Well, that's free. The difference between free speech, though, and whatever it may be disguised as, versus government speech is different. I mean, how you're nudging. So I'm not taking a stance. I just would make that
No, and my
distinction.
point is that the method's sort of irrelevant to the application. Because the methods are there, advertisers know it just as well as diplomats do. It's the application that's...
And I don't think we want to restrict policymakers from using the tools that the other side is using against them. And
Other side? Oh, my goodness.
I absolutely think, I think when we're talking about soda marketers, we're talking about the other side. We're talking about a group of people. I mean, when you're talking about people who are marketing cigarettes, they are the other side. They're acting not in the public good of this country. And the role of the government is to act in the public good of this country. So in every possible way, they are the other side. And if they get to use serving sizes against me, I get to use serving sizes against them.
My soda story, and I'm an economist, so I've got an economic frame of looking at this. I used to teach at Occidental College, and I would live down in San Diego still. So this was a long drive. Usually I would go at night when the traffic had died down between San Diego and Los Angeles, and I would try to have some caffeine. And I went by the 7-Eleven, and they had, 3 different sizes. So one was I forget I'm an economist, not a food guy. So, one was a medium-sized bottle that was 79 cents. One was a slightly bigger bottle. Notice I use medium in there. I think it's smallish. I don't know. Slightly bigger bottle for 99 cents. And then they had this 2-liter jug for 59 cents. I'm an economist. I can't spend more money for less product. So I get this 2-liter thing in my car, and I'm like, Johnny from the mountains. I sling it over my shoulder. I'm driving down the highway, taking little sips every few miles, and I drank way more soda than I should have. I was all wired when I got home, but of course I drank the whole thing because the marginal cost is 0. So
except in bathroom breaks.
It's a curse being an economist. And I didn't know the behavioral stuff until this panel, so now I'll be smarter about it. Listen, I'm going to try to open it up, and I'd really be fascinated, I think, by the set of questions with as rich a topic as this is that we might get from the audience. So, any topic you want, and we'll try to keep our answers short so that we can get as much information in here. And I don't know if we have a microphone to go around. Thumbs up on that? Yes, we do. Okay. So, ma'am, you had the first question. And just wait for a second. Tell us your name, maybe, and where you're from, and we'll respond.
My name is Andra Sandoval, and I'm at the DOJ right now, but
Okay.
I'm actually really interested in international development issues. So I guess my question is, how much overlap in terms of the work any of you do is with behavioral economics, as well as maybe a cultural or anthropological view of, how, if development interventions in countries are accepted by like the populations there?
Right.
And is there any kind of, I'd be interested to hear some additional.
Great. And can you
thoughts on
pass
that.
the microphone right here? He'll be next. People are people. We're Depeche Mode right, or are there cultural differences?
I mean, so my background, I'm not a behavioral economist. I'm a social psychologist. This is explicitly, social psychology explicitly takes into account the fact that there are cultural differences between cultures. We try and control for them in studies or experiment on them in studies. So I think absolutely you need to be sensitive to the environment that there is. The promoting and inhibiting pressures around food in the United States are not the promoting and inhibiting pressures around food in Africa, and they're not even within the United States, right? If you can look at the promoting and inhibiting pressures in Atlanta, which has a huge obesity problem, and New York City, which walks everywhere, and there are incredibly different forces at work. So you do need to be culturally sensitive.
I think from our perspective, we never treat it as if it's an individual's psychologies that are happening, right? It always depends on the context that people are in, what their actions end up at, and social influences and certainly cultural factors play into that. At the same time, so a farmer in Iowa, for instance, is gonna react to things differently. They're gonna have different behaviors than a farmer in Kenya, say, but the same principles and the same sort of analysis and technique we think can help both of them get better outcomes. The actual intervention may look different.
Right. It's like, I think bounded rationality, that's a human phenomena. That's a big behavioral issue. Loss aversion, from what I know, is a universal issue, but the contexts are so different. So, right, Drew?
Yeah, we're all in agreement on this. I don't work in international development in my day job, but in my day job we build, work with companies that build internet products, right? So it's sort of different frame of mind. But if one of our startups is building the next big music analytics platform, and we want to understand how music is consumed all over the world, we go find someone who knows the answer to that, and not just a statistician or an analyst like I am. So context is relevant across all of these things. I think sort of the application, again, is the important thing.
Great. All right, sir, name and question?
My name is Bernie Lee. I'm a summer interning at the Department of Commerce, and I'm a student at Seton Hall University, a graduate student. But my question, when you were talking about data, and you mentioned about humans being rational, and that they're all rational, or they have their moments of emotion. Joe Henrich of UCLA in the mid-90s started an anthropological study talking about how Americans are the weirdest people on earth, because their variation on games like the Prisoner's Dilemma or the Ultimatum game, Americans had a very different way of approaching and had a different set of values that they approached these strategic problems. And then, for as weird as Americans are from the rest from Western Europeans are that much weirder than the rest of the world. So we're a small minority. But then, when it comes to social sciences, how we collect statistics, we are that part. We're that tail end. We're that small tail, and then we're going to have all these. We're creating these studies, and as Drew, you said, you don't want our government to be led by just the Twitterati. And I enjoy Twitter, but I agree with that because I've seen my friends' feeds and I know what I post as well. So how do you, with all these different frameworks and all these different types of data, how can we, it seems like there's a really odd judgment call when you decide to aggregate the data to cover one group, a large group, and then when you decide to say, no, people are individuals or different, as Will just said, a Kenyan farmer is a lot different than an Iowan farmer. So, how do we, and then going back to what Professor Taleb said about data, we need to be looking not at lots of data, but I guess the right data, the data that actually captures the concepts we're doing. How do you guys try to organize all of that and figure this and approach that conundrum?
Drew, do you want to start?
Sure. My initial reaction to that is that the internet as an entity is a gigantic convenience sample. So like research that's done using a convenience sample is automatically biased by that sheer fact. And so as a researcher, as a scientist, it's okay to do research with that kind of data. You're just very cognizant of the fact that all of your conclusions are based on observations that are biased by the data generating process. So like, if I'm doing research on Twitter, it's biased by the fact that at some point, the people who were designing Twitter thought that these 10 variables were important. And that's the things that I work with. So I think, with respect to your question, data's data, that's fine, it's interesting, it's out there, but you just, as a researcher, there's like sort of lots of different modes of analysis that you can be working with. Big data is great because in aggregate we can see lots of interesting behaviors, keeping in mind that the behavior is a convenience sample based on the way that the product, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, decided to collect it. I think on Professor Taleb's point, there's this, when I was listening to him talk about sort of less is more strategy, I think that's absolutely true, but there are instances where there's no reason why big data and less is more can't live together. And I think back to Ken's talk this morning, which was, he mentioned the Google self-driving car, right? So, for those who study computer vision, right, all of computer vision is essentially a reductionary science, right? Because computers don't understand all the spectrums of light and color, but what they can do is they can understand images as they become more simple. So if you actually look at what the self-driving car is doing, is it's taking in lots and lots of data, where that data has been reduced to something simple, right? So it's like those two concepts don't have to compete, they can work together, you just have to be very thoughtful about how you do it. Right? I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what you made me think of.
No, I agree. Just before, I guess what I'm asking though is that there are a lot of people who have asked questions where they say, the statistics say this, or the data tells us to do this, and it seems that they think that just by saying it's science or it's data or it's statistics, they throw out that buzzword that it's a fact or an answer that's concrete and everybody looks at it the same way. How do you, it seems like that fact is being glossed over or not communicated very well in the discussion.
Well, we usually say econometrics tells us to do this, and we just try to end it right there. That's our bias.
So, it may be a linguistic tick you're picking up on. Perhaps the word suggests rather than tells would make you happier. But let me give you a different version of how I think. So I think Drew's point is very correct that there are statistical ways to reduce data to look at it. There's also just how, we use it in psychology, and the way I work with people like Drew, they look at giant data sets and they say, we have the following correlations. We have no idea what they mean. Take them into a lab and see which ones are real. Right? We have a scientific method, and by and large, we use it. Psychologists use it all the time. And so what we don't want to do is have big data be an excuse to never test anything, but it can give us some hints about what we test, right? And that's really, really valuable because the lab tests I do, incredibly expensive as compared to massive data collections that we do, right? They're not massively expensive in the world, right? And you can, do small tests and things so they're not too expensive. But I don't think Will or I would ever suggest that you do an intervention that you haven't tested, right? So you take these big data sets, they suggest some things to you that you might try. You go and develop some strategies on top of them, and then you test those strategies. Earlier, Drew and I were sort of joking around about, people were talking about A/B testing earlier. Look, we're always going to, A/B testing only works if you have someone to create the A and someone to create the B, right? Like, computers are really, really bad at that, right? So we'll need people to create these programs to look at that data and then try to test them. And I think Will and I would agree on that.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I don't think we would ever, it's not at my shop, we wouldn't say like, oh, here's the prisoner's dilemma study, therefore do this intervention, right? It would be, we would go through our process, look at the context, do our sort of behavioral mapping that we call it, and then generate hypotheses that then we might take to big data, or we might take to other sources of data and test and see if there might be some interesting evidence pointing, suggesting that. And then from there, we do what Professor Taleb said, or you call it A/B testing, you call it prototyping, you call it tinkering. You set up rigorous methods for testing your assumptions and testing your designs, and with an eye towards being able to eventually scale them up and have an impact.
I think just one real quick thing, and it is important in this context. Big data and data science are big buzzwords, and for me, it seems like much of what data science is sort of a theoretical, statistically descriptive science, right? So I have this large data set, now I have these tools that I can count at large scale what's going on in them. But what these guys do is real science, right? Start with a theory, test. That's science, that's discovery, and I think maybe that's closer to what you're saying. Like, yes, popular descriptions of what data science and big data are all void of that, and that's very dangerous.
Okay, can I see hands for other questions that might want to be asked? Okay, yes, ma'am.
I just want to, this is curiosity, I want to hear what Will did as a follow-on to understanding that a competition would bring down the road death rate in West Cape. In other words, are they going to have a competition every December, or?
I believe so. The cabinet in the Western Cape is very excited about lotteries. They're trying to do it in almost everything they do now, which is perhaps some of the danger of this. I mean, it'd be interesting
because
to
it
see
didn't
if it'll
seem like a
work.
durable fix. You know, it's cute, but it's interesting if it's not the same as Matt's wish to bring down the price of fruit so that the poor people don't walk out of the grocery store loaded with crap.
Sure.
But buy the healthy food. In the lottery, it's interesting, but it seems that it would wear out, that the effect of that on deaths on the road would kind of fizzle after a time.
Because, and I agree, the sort of question of the stickiness of a lot of these behavior change interventions is something that we think about a lot and we worry about a lot when we're trying to design them. In this case, because there's such a spike in December around the holidays, the combination of sort of the end of year holidays and New Year's and summer holidays and getting time off, a once a year lottery, people forget pretty fast. People are pretty myopic, and it may not show the same dramatic effects, but anything for $6,000 is.
Yeah, I mean, let me echo on that sort of from a psychological perspective. Human beings are incredibly adaptable, and we know that from things like the hedonic treadmill and other sort of phenomena that we get accustomed to the things around us pretty fast, right? And that's why it's incumbent on people like us to figure out new solutions and new ways of doing things. And maybe this year it's a lottery until the lottery doesn't work anymore, and then we look for a new thing where we need the next incremental gain. I mean, I think that the key here is that, it's to apply this kind of science as nimbly as we can, so we come up with as many different things that we can try and recognize that, hey, the things that we tried yesterday may not work today, right? Even price, even price, people get used to prices, and marketers from the other side figure out how to fight against it, and then we fight back, and that's what it is. I mean, we always fight a war over behavior.
I'm going to start to interrupt the questions, and where the next question might be, it's going to maybe be here if we can get the microphone up. But I keep thinking how to map, what are the issues that we're talking about that we want to nudge in diplomacy? I want to nudge dictators, right? We all want to nudge dictators and make them less dictatorial, but we also, what are the other issues that we think we might be able to nudge on or need to be nudged on? I would say, it'd be fun to get maybe a collection here of thoughts, let's nudge on deforestation and despoiling green spaces. We can, I think in America we're already engaged in that, but we have a lot of parkland. The incentives, though, in a world that's suddenly globalized for poor countries to develop like that and not put a primacy on their green space is one that we should be concerned in if we all share the same world, right? So are there things the U.S. could and should do to nudge that behavior? What are some other issues where we can apply these lessons we've gotten from fighting, say, against the tobacco companies? It's great to me if the rest of the world smokes less, but is that really a global issue that we want to fight? Is it the same priority as preserving the environment, or convincing some countries not to load up in debt in foreign currencies that then destabilizes the financial system? Are those the right questions? Are those the right issues?
I think we could have a very long, complicated moral discussion about that. I'll give you my rule of thumb.
But what's your number one that you want to target?
I'll give you my rule of thumb. The later the consequence of doing it, the more interested I am in changing it, right? And so health behaviors are, let's take health behaviors for a second, right? They're a great example of where we can apply this sort of things, and lots of people should do that, and it's very important. But we've actually responded relatively quickly in sort of man years to problems, right? Smoking rose and then fell off in the period of 50 years, which in human existence is the blink of an eye, right? The longer out the consequence is, the less likely it is that people are addressing it, and that's where, if you're looking for novel green space things to do, that's where you should be looking, I think.
Yeah, I mean, sort of there's this subset of like possible things that you can do with respect to nudging in the context of this conversation, which is like, what are the things for which human behavior and the concept that they're making the decision is influenced through these things. So the thing that, so deforestation is an interesting one, but that's largely like an economic, like the lever there is like either you develop this country and you prosper or you don't, right? And so maybe there are nudges, but the thing that becomes more obvious to me is sort of like, can we make it so that needle sharing is sort of the knowledge around that is that it is a bad behavior, so that we get less disease transmission that way. And I think there have been campaigns in parts of Africa where HIV and AIDS is very prevalent. Sort of like the use of contraceptive and the lack of needle sharing is the culture around that, and the information is so poor that they just try to add information to that as a nudge, rather than actually say like, we're going to make it illegal for you to do X, to sort of add information to the system and try to have positive behavior happen.
Right. So another one that comes to mind, if a country is caught in a bed of a poverty trap, we know now a lot of that is you need to make investments in human capital a generation before, so that you're not stuck with a low skill, uneducated, illiterate. You want to enhance literacy. You want kids to stay in school in poorer countries. And that's awfully hard sometimes if they can make more short-term money from putting the kids in the field, picking turnips or whatever it might be. So do you pay kids to go to school? Some countries have actually experimented on that without any nudging by the U.S., but those
including this one. We've experimented on that in this country.
Right, and they seem to be working. So that's one where I'm enthused about, and maybe there's a role for diplomacy. But Will, did you have a number one, a sort of global issue that you'd like to maybe focus these toolkits on?
I mean, to be honest, I'm curious to hear what the audience has to say on that. We don't necessarily think we know what the top problems are, because they often when you don't, we are not necessarily the experts in each individual context. When the way that problems are currently defined, oftentimes have a lot of assumptions embedded in them. Right? So even the way we talk about deforestation as only being, or smoking as being like only information or only banning,
right?
It's always a question about like you said, giving more information to individuals as being the way out. There's a lot of challenges out there, and I think we'd be curious and excited about tackling all of them.
I made you wait for so long. Ma'am, if you want to go ahead.
You actually touched on quite a few issues. So first of all, role of diplomacy. You talked about how it's changed. It's true, it's no longer passing of the information. I think it's ability of influencing the world events and governments. So we're moving from passing information to charm, wit, and charisma, which comes back to the human factor. That's what I think. Second thing, and I cannot pass it, I'm a new American who was born under communist regime, so as much as I'm truly for people, I have to just urge that we have to be very careful how much power we give to government, telling people what should they eat and how should they eat. The two biggest calamities of 20th century was Mao Zedong, China, and Stalin, Russia. Stalin murdered 60 million people in the name of the good of the people, and Mao Zedong, 81 million people in the name of the good of the people. So we have to really remember that some of us should make mistakes. Some of us should decide for ourselves. It's okay. My question is about the marshmallow test. I don't know how far you took the test, but I heard about marshmallow test and ability of waiting. And I understand that people who wait for a word are actually the people who achieve more. Can you elaborate on that? Because apparently the kids which have ability to wait are kids which score the most in schools and then achieve high incomes.
I'll let you answer that. I know if they'd used a banana, it would have only been good to eat for like 5 minutes. That's the problem. You don't want to eat it too early. You don't want to wait too long. I could have waited for the banana.
Yeah, so there's a couple thoughts on that. Yes, the original kids that managed to wait longer and hold out did have higher SAT scores and showed higher success late in life. There's also interesting things related to grit and sort of the ability to either distract themselves or occupy themselves with other tasks, and you know that were related as well to their ability to.
And the
hold on.
follow-up, the original research was done not looking at what was going to happen, and the scholar came back, what was it, 10 years later, and tracked the same individuals
yeah.
down and found there were powerful correlations between those who were more patient to some of these things, successes in life, higher incomes. I can't remember all the variables that they tracked.
I'd also say, I think at the beginning of your remarks just now, you said that the diplomacy is moving more towards influence and away from just being about information. I guess I'd always thought that diplomacy was always about influence, you know, and even, you know, the subtle things, you know, the stories that just a few that I hear, and I'm not an expert on these things, but, you know, about like whether or not meetings are going to be held on Moscow time or DC time, you know, and things like that make a big the pictures of LBJ towering over people, and I mean, it's always influence.
All right.
I mean, the privilege of being on the panel is that we get the final word for questions in the audience. and I would remind you, you know, you were talked about the 60 million people that Stalin killed. How many people have had their lives cut short by obesity-related diseases and health causes in the United States alone over the last 100 years and over the next 100 years?
Well, and I'll take the last word.
Hold on. Wait.
Okay, you
hold on a second.
Then
So, I mean, and I want to caution you, I will put the blame firmly on myself if what it sounds like I'm advocating for is a police state. What I'm advocating for is your choices are already limited. You can't get a soda in any size you want, right? There's already an array of choices. And health is one input into what those choices should be, right? There's a way to talk about choice that doesn't mean that more is always better, because we know that more choice can have serious deleterious effects on everything from health to happiness, right? More choice is not always better.
That's well said. I think constraining behavior is what we're talking about. You know, constraining the behavior of businesses is something that's already considered appropriate in so many areas. How they market sugary drinks is a behavior that then gets into constraining the behavior of consumers. But ultimately, I think you're right. The first priority is how constrained is the behavior of the government? Because when you start pulling on that thread of letting the government be unconstrained to control the people, we know where it leads. And that's intentional killing, which is quite different from health-related killing or auto accidents on the road. So it's an important one to keep in mind.
But how is obesity not intentional killing, right? If I know as a marketer that making people fat...
We've got 10 minutes. I want to get some other questions because I know where we're going to go with this, and it's not that fun.
Thanks, Greg Hicks, State Department employee. And very much, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and so the concepts of imagery leading to emotional response has been part of my experience there, and I'd like to hear perhaps a little bit more on that in terms of perhaps as a diplomat or as public diplomacy practitioners, how we might consider options along those lines, especially from your point of view. The other thing is, what do diplomats do in a world of massive amounts of data, massive amounts of information? In my practice, I think we act as filters. I think we take the data sets down, take all this information out, we turn it into the message that we want to deliver to our foreign interlocutors. And the question is, how do we take all this information and make sure that we get our messaging right? So, thanks very much.
Sure. I can speak a little bit to the first question. I mean, I think that we can learn from private industry how we can use imagery and other things to help people experience emotions that change their decisions. I mean, we talked about marketing, right? So marketing has a natural system where they say, if you can come up with the greatest marketing message, I'll hire you, right? You'll come up with some marketing messages, you'll compete as agencies, and I'll pick one of you and I'll give you a ton of money to sell my thing, right? And so we could do the same thing. I mean, we can run a contest that says, I am looking for photo submissions that best portray the dangers of obesity or the dangers of genocide or these other things. And we can, at a fraction of the cost, get amazing serendipitous photographs, in part because there are so many and so many people, that message can reach so many people. So that's one possibility.
I mean, I would approach the second question. So like the problem that you're describing, I think, is generally, I mean, I worked in the intelligence community, and I think the diplomatic community is a similar thing. What you're describing is how do you find good analysts, right? Because now the job of the analyst is much harder simply as a function of the data that they're expected to process. So there isn't a good answer to that question except that analysts need to keep up with the technology, right? So part of this is literally like a training problem, right? So it's like, if you're expecting your analysts to be able to ingest and report back to you a synthesized piece of analysis based on volumes of sort of web scale volume of data, then there's training and tools that they need to be made aware of. But then there's the smart creative thinker side, which intelligence community and the diplomatic community has always been good at training, right? So I think there's this component now that will have to come in, and like from my experience in industry, right, industry is not any better at this. The supply demand curve for people with these tool skills is definitely in the favor of people demanding high salaries, right? So it's a difficult question, but I think really what you're describing is how do we train the next generation of analysts to be good at the thing they've always been good at and be able to handle this volume of data and do that thing at this scale.
I saw another hand up. There's a question here.
Hi, my name is Cameo. I'm a student at Syracuse University, finishing my graduate degree in public diplomacy. And I was wondering, I, like the woman down here, am interested in global development. And I was wondering if you could talk to how to change a choice environment to fight corruption. Because if corrupt officials are the ones making decisions, they're going to continue to create an environment and make decisions that are going to create an environment that is beneficial to them, but not necessarily for their people.
Right. Interesting. So the my thoughts on corruption are interesting, that we find more corruption in places that have more regulations. And in fact, there's the economic research on rent seeking is that's why there are more regulations. So it turns out there's a 180-day waiting period that if you pay the official becomes a 10-day waiting period. They want it to be a longer waiting period. They want there to be more bureaucracy, more forms to be filled, so that then they have a reason for corruption. So if you want to fight corruption, you have to wait to make, I think one of our panelists said, you got to keep things simple. You know, so you want to do smart regulation and have it be as efficient as possible. That's the best environment you can do. Because humans, I'm a people are people kind of guy. Even government bureaucrats, they're operating in a rational environment. They have children that they want to build up incomes for. And if they can do it through corruption, then they will. So you have to think systemically how to limit those opportunities. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a place where I don't know if we've seen it proven yet, but a big place for big data, for transparency, and sort of government regulations and data, and also potentially for crowdsourcing. You know, I think there's been a couple apps in India, maybe a couple other places where you just sort of, every time you ask for a bribe, you just tweet it or send a text. And then you come up with some interesting maps and interesting visualizations of that information.
That's fascinating.
I mean, even if you take the example that Tim used of the 180-day waiting period, hey, you want to find corruption in that system? Look for the people who get them through in 10 days, right? If you're using proper data science and you look at the data and you go, okay, the median is this, and then there are some outliers, it's worth taking a look at why the outliers are the outliers.
Great. I think we might have time for one more question and round of conversation. And if I don't see a hand, then let me go ahead and press for final thoughts on maybe what you guys have learned from each other's presentations and the questions from the crowd. And Matt, if you can start, we'll go this way.
Sure. I've been privileged to know Drew for a while. Will's new to me, but clearly we're in simpatico. I mean, I think that, what I would take away from this is a measured approach to behavior change and big data, right? We've heard about the dangers of what happens when you restrict choice too much and the dangers when you don't restrict it enough, right? We've heard about bad things you can do with big data and the good things you can do with big data. And so a lot of this is about intentionality, right? I'm not with Tim on the sort of like people are just people. People are pushed around by their environments a lot. But one of the things that has consistently been true is that talking about ethics and having that be part of the national discussion everywhere that we are for every person helps us make those decisions in the right way. Because as we get access to new tools and have more power, the individual ethics of people are going to become incredibly important.
Let's go down the line, yeah. So I'd say two takeaways or closing thoughts. The first, of all the things that I maybe wish I'd talked about more today, I'd say is being careful in how you define the challenges and problems that you face, and try to strip down as many of the assumptions that you might have baked into them as possible. So it's not about sort of whether people value, their deforestation, whether they value their forest resources enough, or whether they, it's too easy for them to do certain things. Really, the fundamental thing there is we want people to stop cutting down trees, right? And when you define the problem in that way, it allows you to think a little bit more clearly about what exactly the outcome is that you want, right? It's not that they be able to pass a test saying trees are worth this much to me, or swear that trees are part of my moral fiber, or it would be that they would be cutting down fewer trees, and then you think about ways to get to that outcome, right? So that would be the first thing, and then the second would just be to tinker and test and prototype and this is an emerging field. There is a lot, there's decades of research in psychology and social psychology. The question of how that transfers from the lab to the field is a real one, but try it out and test it, and I think we'll see some great successes. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, particularly in what we do in policy. Even just cutting down the paperwork in half would probably make a lot of good things happen.
So one first thing is I'll say, Matt, on your presentation, I was very relieved when you put the 4 boxes up. I thought you were going to say the answer was Windows 8. So that I didn't see that. I wasn't sure about that. But so I don't have a sort of big statement to make here, but I will say this. I used to live in D.C. and I loved it, and now I'm up in New York. And being back down here, it's really invigorating to talk to people from the diplomatic community, because you have so many great questions that you're interested in, right? And people like me, I spend most of my time like looking at rows and columns of data and thinking about ways to kind of solve a problem that's presented to me. I would encourage all of you in the audience and talk to your colleagues. There is a huge community of people here in D.C. who have skills and don't know how to, and want to learn the problems that you have and would be willing to work on them for fun, right? So there's like data science DC meetup, there's the like machine learning meetup that's down here. If you really are interested, just go and talk to people, and like if the conversation goes in one direction, just raise your hand and say like, at work we had this problem and I don't know what data exists, because I promise you someone there will know about it, and then just work with them. Because this is a really exciting time, because there's a lot of people who have skills that are sort of problem poor, right? Skill rich, problem poor, data rich, problem poor, and you guys have lots of problems, and you're interested in figuring out the answers, right? So go collaborate with those people, and I'm happy to like send you URLs to stuff that exists in DC if you don't already know about it.
Good. Wow. I've learned a lot more than I expected. Before I conclude my remarks, afterwards there are 2-liter bottles of sugared water outside, so be careful on the way home. It is fascinating to me to think that when this country was founded, the diplomatic challenge was just a basic marketing message. We exist to send our diplomats out. In a world where information was essentially zero and you had to provide signal that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And now we live in a world where there's so much noise, you're trying to filter that signal to some extent. what struck me in our conversation was, it feels like we're talking about this as if there's an endpoint, but we're not at an endpoint. We're in an environment that's evolving so rapidly, and when we're all old men on this panel, the world will be so wired, and it'll be a completely different set of challenges. So who knows if this notion, when I was in graduate school, the nation state, some people predicted would decline, and there would be different institutional ways of organizing. That seems not to be bearing out completely, but you can see patterns like that are still in process. So who knows where we go from here. I do think this lens of big data is going to become more important, and behavioral economics is really important to help us all shape a better world together. So thanks to the State Department for putting on this panel and you all for joining us. Please help me in thanking our panel. Have a nice weekend.